In the stillness of a fog-drenched London morning, a guarded black vehicle pulled through the palace gates, its contents unknown, its destination tightly shielded. But what emerged would set Buckingham ablaze with whispers. Princess Beatrice, rarely one to make waves, quietly entered the Queen's private wing, clutching a locked archive case marked with a crimson royal seal. Its recipient? Not the Queen consort, but Catherine. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The vehicle's arrival was timed with surgical precision, no motorcade, no security flare, no staff-wide notice. The only indication that something unusual was underway came from a lone figure stepping out into the early grey light. Beatrice, poised but with a hint of anxious resolve, carried the weight of more than just documents. The archive case, slightly worn at the edges, but still gleaming with authority, bore markings long associated with Queen Elizabeth's personal vault. The crimson seal wasn't decorative, it was binding, meant to be opened only by the person named in the Queen's handwritten registry, and that person, it seemed, was Catherine. Beatrice's decision to personally deliver the contents added another layer of bewilderment. This wasn't her usual realm. While the princess has always floated within the royal circle, her involvement in matters of state or archival legacy had been virtually non-existent until now. That alone sent quiet alarm bells ringing across the palace corridors. Why her? Why now? And why in a manner so meticulously off the record? No palace clerk had logged the delivery, no aide from Camilla's office had been informed. There were no scheduled appointments, no overlapping diaries, and no visible trace of coordination with the Queen consort circle. The omission wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Camilla, who typically maintains an iron grip over anything linked to the monarchy's narrative and legacy, was left entirely out of the loop. There was no consultation, no preview, no courtesy notice. Her absence from the chain of knowledge was not only glaring, it was damning. Catherine's team, meanwhile, received the handover behind closed doors in a quiet drawing room. Only 2 staffers witnessed the moment, and both have remained unusually silent. Their silence, too, speaks volumes. This wasn't a ceremonial gesture. It was a transfer of power, symbolic, yes, but also procedural, and potentially constitutional. That the archives moved without Camilla's awareness was the first clear signal that the royal family's internal power map was being redrawn, not by decree, but by allegiance. And those allegiances were no longer neatly aligned behind the current Queen consort. Catherine, it seemed, had become the recipient of not just the Queen's archives, but of Queen Elizabeth's silent trust. Beatrice, in delivering them, had cast her lot, and the ramifications were about to unfold far beyond a single corridor or wing. But what exactly was inside that sealed archive case? And why did Beatrice, of all royals, act as the courier? The answers would send tremors through the monarchy. Locked away for decades beneath stone and silence, the palace archives are more than mere history. They are royal memory, scandal, and legacy. What Catherine unsealed in her drawing room wasn't just parchment. It was power raw, unfiltered, and dangerous. The moment the crimson seal cracked, the air in the room shifted. Inside the heavy leather-bound case were layers of documents, aged, annotated, many still folded along creases untouched since the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. Some pages were yellowed with time, others pristine, but each bore the unmistakable weight of consequence. Near the top, thick envelopes sealed in wax were stamped monarch's eyes only. No clerk had logged these. No aide had processed them. They were meant to bypass the system entirely. And now they sat in the hands of the Princess of Wales. Her hands trembled as she read. The first letter was penned in Diana's unmistakable cursive, personal, pleading, and strangely prophetic, addressed not to Charles nor to William, but to Queen Elizabeth herself. In it, Diana spoke of her fears, of a monarchy she no longer recognized, and of her belief that the future rested not in titles, but in character. She referenced a young woman, not yet visible in public life, who she believed would one day hold the spirit of the crown more than any consort ever could. Beneath that letter were financial disclosures, some known to only 3 people in the realm. quiet amendments to royal wills, trust allocations with no names attached, and inheritance clauses written in conditional language. More shocking still was a notarized note from Elizabeth herself, dated years before her passing, stating that these contents were to be delivered privately and securely, not to the reigning consort, but to the rightful steward of legacy. No name was listed, but a thin gold slip enclosed beneath the parchment bore only one word: Catherine. There were testimonies too, typed statements from former royal aides, sealed and indexed, each recounting events that had long been erased from the official narrative. Affairs buried, alliances redrawn, and a quiet warning about what might happen if the archives were ever altered or suppressed. But the most jarring find came in the form of a letter labelled simply Succession Memorandum. It referenced a review of the royal line following the Queen's death, and included commentary from advisors who had reportedly questioned the optics of CA. Camilla holding ceremonial dominion over legacy affairs. A section was underlined 3 times. Should public confidence decline, this archive shall serve as silent affirmation of the intended transition. Catherine sat in silence, surrounded by names she'd never heard, events never told to the public, and truths that were never meant for the light. It wasn't merely information, it was a reckoning. The weight wasn't just historical, it was personal. This wasn't meant to end up in Camilla's hands. Not ever. And that truth, buried for so long, was now hers to carry. If these records were meant for Catherine all along, who made that decision? And why was Beatrice the chosen messenger? She's been called compliant, quiet, loyal to a fault. But beneath Princess Beatrice's royal smile lies the bloodline of a woman once cast to the sidelines, Sarah Ferguson. And now, for the first time, Beatrice has made a move that suggests her silence was never submission, it was strategy. For years, Beatrice walked the tightrope between 2 powerful women, Catherine, the poised future queen beloved by the public, and Camilla, the embattled consort still fighting for full legitimacy in the royal court. While others chose sides openly, Beatrice mastered the art of existing between the lines. She played her part with grace, her loyalties unreadable. But as the palace began to strain under the weight of internal fractures, something changed. Her once neutral presence at family functions began to shift. She lingered longer at Catherine's side during private dinners. She shared more than polite smiles. She listened. And Catherine, astute and aware, welcomed it not with grand gestures but with trust. Behind closed doors, Beatrice had begun questioning decisions she once accepted without hesitation. Camilla's consolidation of patronages had caused quiet discontent. Several legacy charities once aligned with the Queen Mother had been rerouted to Camilla's network, bypassing younger royals entirely. Beatrice, watching beloved causes lose visibility, was no longer comfortable with silence. Still, she said nothing aloud. Instead, she observed. She noted the shifts, and she waited. What most didn't know was that Beatrice had been given access to something extraordinary. Queen Elizabeth's final archive directives tucked away in a private registry that few even knew existed. The late monarch, perhaps wary of palace politics spiraling beyond control, had taken steps to preserve the integrity of the archives through a chain of custodianship. It's believed that Beatrice, through her close relationship with her grandmother, was quietly looped into this system. A contingency plan wrapped in loyalty and discretion. And when the time came, it wasn't coincidence that placed the archive case in her hands. It was design. There had been signs, subtle but deliberate. At a recent garden reception, Camilla made a public gesture meant to direct Beatrice toward a waiting group of foreign delegates. Beatrice smiled, nodded, and turned the opposite way. Another time, when the Queen Consort hosted an event at Clarence House, Beatrice was one of the few who arrived late and departed early. Some aides chalked it up to scheduling, others weren't so sure. The quiet defiance was beginning to form a pattern. Inside the palace, whispers turned to quiet acknowledgement. Beatrice wasn't drifting aimlessly between rival queens. She was watching them both and choosing. And when she walked those halls with the archive case meant for Catherine, the message became unmissable. She wasn't aligning with tradition. She was placing a bet on the future. and in doing so, she forced every observer to re-evaluate everything they thought they knew about the quiet princess. But Beatrice didn't act alone, and as eyes too. RN to Catherine, the question grows louder. What will she do with what she now knows? The documents in Catherine's hands could realign royal power, embarrass the establishment and isolate her from those she still calls family. With the world watching her every move, she must make a choice, preserve the crown's illusion, or reveal the truth that could rewrite it all. She sat in silence for hours, staring at the sea of paper spread across her desk pages that held not only names and numbers, but buried truths and uncomfortable legacies. The weight of Queen Elizabeth's intentions pressed down on her like a whisper too loud to ignore. This was not just history. It was ammunition, evidence, proof of conversations that were never meant to see daylight. And in her hands, it was both a blessing and a burden. Catherine, raised on dignity, silence, and duty, now faced a decision that no consort had ever been asked to make: uphold a system designed to outlast scandal, or honor a private trust that could shatter it. Behind the gilded doors of Kensington Palace, she turned first to the only person she could confide in, William. Their conversations were whispered, urgent, stretched late into the night, and for once he did not offer an answer. His own loyalty to his father battled against a deeper, quieter understanding of what this archive represented. It was more than inheritance, it was direction. And though he would never say it aloud, Catherine could feel his fear that this might be the very thing that divides the family forever. But even he couldn't deny the truth. The Queen had made a choice, and now Catherine had to decide what to do with it. Her instinct was to protect. The monarchy had already been bruised by years of internal feuds and public suspicion. Revealing the contents of the archive could rupture the fragile threads holding the institution together. But something in her refused to simply lock it all away. Especially not after discovering a single sheet that bore their son's name, George, linked to a trust fund structured decades ago but never activated. The page raised chilling questions. Why was it concealed? Who stood to lose if it came to light? And what had the Queen intended when she marked it with her signature? Catherine's silence became strategic. She delayed informing King Charles, careful not to trigger a wave of defensiveness before she understood the full implications. She took fewer calls. She attended engagements with a calm that looked polished but was laced with thought. And when she stood beside Camilla, there was a new distance, unspoken but visible. No confrontation, just a quiet removal of warmth. Those closest to her noticed. The more the archive consumed her, the more composed she became. But it wasn't attachment, it was preparation. Because in the undercurrent of her calm, a storm was forming. And while Catherine treaded carefully, Camilla began to sense the shift, not in words but in behavior. The delay in briefings, the silence from staff, the glances exchanged between aides. Something was happening, and though Catherine had yet to act, the atmosphere made it clear secrets were surfacing and control was slipping. As Catherine weighs her next step, Camilla catches wind of something amiss, and her fury is neither quiet nor contained. The moment Queen Camilla heard whispers of the archive transfer, the atmosphere inside Clarence House turned electric. "What delivery?" she reportedly demanded. Within hours, she stormed the palace not for answers, but for control. And what followed was a clash that aides say will echo for generations. It began with a single, hushed conversation between two junior aides in a corridor. A quiet remark, an overheard name, Catherine's, a reference to something sealed and direct from Beatrice. Within minutes, the whisper reached Camilla's inner circle, and the Queen Consort's reaction was instant. She summoned her senior staff, her voice clipped and sharp, demanding a full report on all recent archive withdrawals. Names, times, authorizations. She wanted every document logged, every file moved, and every signature matched. But what came back was worse than silence. It was absence. No one had any record of a formal transfer. There had been no sign-out, no chain of custody. Nothing official. That was the first clue that this wasn't just an oversight. It was a deliberate exclusion. Her fury was uncontainable. Staff later described her as pacing the room, eyes blazing, repeating the same phrase over and over. This wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the humiliation. For a queen consort who had spent years clawing her way into legitimacy, to be left out of something so profound wasn't just a slight. It was a signal, one she couldn't ignore. She went straight to Charles. The meeting was closed door, but palace sources revealed she pointed the finger squarely at Beatrice, accusing her of collusion and intentional sabotage. Charles reportedly listened in uncomfortable silence, torn between two forces he could no longer balance. But Camilla wasn't finished. She began drafting plans to reassign control over the royal archivists, those who had served the Queen Mother, the late Queen Elizabeth, and now, potentially, Catherine. In her view, access equaled power, and that power had just been handed off behind her back. The consort's threat was subtle but unmistakable. Those who failed to inform her would find themselves quietly replaced. She sent word through her private secretary to summon Catherine for a formal discussion to clarify, to correct, to reassert dominance. But there was no reply, no acknowledgement, just silence. That sill. Ents spoke louder than any confrontation. For Camilla, it wasn't just about the archives anymore. It was about respect, authority, relevance. And in that moment she realized something devastating. Her reign, though official, was no longer uncontested. Not in practice, not in influence, and perhaps not even in loyalty. But Camilla's rage only accelerated a quiet campaign that had already been underway, and at its center, King Charles was forced into a corner. To the world he is king, but behind palace walls, Charles is a man torn between the wife he crowned and the daughter-in-law his mother always favored. As the archives scandal unfolds, he is forced to confront the ghosts of Elizabeth's legacy and decide which woman defines the crown's future. He knew it the moment the whispers reached him, not just of a delivery, but of the specific courier and the recipient. Beatrice and Catherine, not Camilla. Charles's expression didn't shift, but inside, the tremor hit. He had known in fragments about the archive. His mother had mentioned it in passing once, an enigmatic reference to documents that would surface when the time was right. But Charles had never asked questions. Some truths, he feared, were easier to leave buried, and now they had risen, not with ceremony but in silence, delivered quietly, bypassing protocol, and arriving squarely into the hands of a woman who bore neither his blood nor his name, but who, undeniably, bore the public's loyalty. In the privacy of his study, he found himself drifting back, haunted by the ghosts of two women whose shadows still lingered. Diana, with her searing vulnerability, whose presence even in absence refused to fade, and Elizabeth, with her iron will, whose decisions still dictated the family's every move. He couldn't ignore the irony. He had fought so hard for Camilla's place at the center of the monarchy. He had endured scandal, resistance, and time itself to place her where she now stood. And yet, in a matter of days, all of it felt uncertain again. Because the institution his mother protected with her life had quietly chosen another torchbearer. And that torch was now in Catherine's grasp. His advisors urged neutrality. They knew the optics. Any sign of support for Catherine over Camilla could ignite a firestorm. But doing nothing carried its own risks. Charles was not blind to the tension inside the palace walls, nor was he deaf to the public's growing attachment to the Princess of Wales. The younger generation didn't remember the battles of the past. They saw in Catherine a calming future, steady, gracious, and, perhaps most importantly, untouched by the controversies that had marred others. One night, when sleep refused him, Charles sought out Anne. The conversation was long and heavy, filled with more silence than speech. She listened, as she always had, without judgment. But when she finally spoke, her words landed like a weight. "You knew what she intended, Charles. Don't act surprised." He didn't respond. Because he wasn't surprised, only afraid. Afraid that if he acted, he would unravel the very balance he had tried to restore. And so he chose what seemed safest: silence. But even silence can't stop momentum. And as word of the archive transfer leaks, the public begins to weigh in. The headlines hit like lightning. Palace archives secretly transferred, Camilla blindsided. But it was the reaction from the public that stunned the monarchy. Overnight, the people rallied not around the queen consort, but around the woman they already saw as their future queen. Within hours, social media transformed into a digital battleground. Hashtags surged across platforms. Hashtag Queen Catherine, hashtag Beatrice Bold, and hashtag Elizabeth's Choice trended globally. The world wasn't waiting for the palace to explain it. Had already decided who it believed. In Catherine, the public saw continuity, calm, and quiet strength. In Camilla, many saw the shadow of an era they'd hoped the monarchy had moved beyond. And while the palace remained officially silent, the online realm roared with speculation and fervour. Photos of Catherine stoic, regal and composed circulated alongside quotes from the late Queen, recontextualized to frame her as the chosen heir to tradition, not just a consort by marriage. Royal commentators, once hesitant to draw hard lines, began to shift. Their language, once measured, subtly leaned in Catherine's favour. Long-time broadcasters referenced Queen Elizabeth's known affection for her daughter-in-law. Tabloids that once picked apart her wardrobe now dissected the archive's implications with almost reverent seriousness. The BBC's most senior correspondent called the situation the most symbolic break in royal continuity since Diana. Public trust wasn't simply shifting, it was consolidating. Meanwhile, historical scholars dove into Elizabeth's sealed directives. What had once been a private matter of record-keeping became the centre of national debate. Academics and former palace aides were called onto news panels to speculate on what a transfer like this meant, and why Camilla had not been involved. Theories took root, that Elizabeth had deliberately circumvented formal channels, that Catherine's image had long been cultivated as the monarchy's insurance policy, and most damning of all, that Camilla was never meant to hold the spiritual weight of the crown. For Camilla, the backlash was swift and unforgiving. Supporters who once defended her right to be queen consort began to go quiet. Invitations to engagements were not rescinded, but enthusiasm dulled. Photographers who once clamoured for her arrival began angling for Catherine's presence instead. Royal aides, sensing a shift in public mood, began repositioning their loyalties not through words, but through action. Catherine's initiatives suddenly found greater funding, faster approval, broader coverage. The machinery of the monarchy had not stopped, but it had quietly started turning in her favour. In a matter of days, Catherine's public image ascended beyond protocol. She was no longer just the Princess of Wales. She had become a symbol of preserved legacy, the living embodiment of the Queen's memory. And as her presence grew stronger, so too did the silence from Clarence House, a silence that many interpreted as surrender. But even as the tide turned fully toward Catherine, another shock was on its way. And just as public support reaches a crescendo, an unexpected voice from the past breaks the silence. Deep within the archives was a letter sealed in lavender wax, addressed simply to the one who walks beside the crown. Its contents had never been read until now, and as Catherine finished reading, her hands trembled. It was the Queen's voice, and it changed everything. The envelope had been tucked into the spine of a leather folio, nearly hidden among decades of correspondence. It was unmarked by any official seal, but the wax bore the faint imprint of a signet. Only a few had ever seen Queen Elizabeth's personal emblem, reserved for matters of the heart, not state. Inside, the ink had barely faded. The words, though carefully composed, bore unmistakable intimacy. The letter did not begin with a title, but with a name, Catherine. What followed was not a command, but a calling. Elizabeth spoke of legacy not as a crown to be worn, but a weight to be carried with grace. She named Catherine the keeper of continuity, a phrase heavy with meaning, binding in tone. And then came the line that struck like a bell: "You are the pillar on which the next age must stand. When others seek power, let yours be the presence that steadies." There was no mention of Camilla, not once, but there was acknowledgement of conflict. The Queen warned of those who rushed toward power rather than carry it quietly, a haunting echo that rang loudly in the context of all that had unfolded. It was not a critique, it was a caution, a glimpse into the Queen's final act of protection. What she had seen coming, she hadn't voiced publicly, but here, in this final letter, her intentions were laid bare. "The archives," she wrote, were not just historical, they were transitional. Not everything is passed by proclamation. Some inherit through silence, through consistency. And to them I leave what cannot be seen. One paragraph was reserved entirely for Beatrice. Elizabeth praised her judgment, her loyalty, her ability to navigate both sides of the family without bitterness. She thanked her, explicitly, for ensuring the archives would reach the right hands. That moment alone reframed everything. Beatrice hadn't just acted out of personal conviction, she had followed a directive whispered from a matriarch who knew the tides of power before they turned. Catherine read the letter aloud to William that night, her voice cracking with the weight of it. Their children sat nearby, too young to grasp the gravity, yet quieted by the emotion in the room. It was a moment unrecorded by cameras but indelibly marked on memory. In that room, Catherine wasn't just a wife or a mother or a consort. She was a witness to history, and now the bearer of its next chapter. But Catherine's next move wouldn't be emotional, it would be constitutional. She didn't ask for it. She didn't campaign for it. But now she holds the archives, the Queen's final letter, and the will of the people. Catherine's quiet rise has become unstoppable, and for the first time, the crown looks less divided and more decided. In the days that followed the revelation of the Queen's final letter, Catherine moved not with noise, but with precision. She didn't need declarations or statements. Her authority didn't come from titles, it came from trust. And so, with calm determination, she began the work that many had feared, and some had quietly hoped she would undertake. The first sign came within palace channels. Ceremonial correspondence, once routed through Clarence House or divided between royal offices, now found a new destination: Catherine's team. No announcement was made, but staffers understood the message. Elizabeth's legacy was not being preserved in name, but in action. The contents of the archives began shaping internal decisions. Certain patronages, long neglected, were revived. Youth programs Elizabeth had once cherished were suddenly at the center of royal engagement. Catherine wasn't just honoring history, she was giving it direction. And those who had witnessed her transformation from outsider to anchor now stepped closer. Most notably, Beatrice, once a quiet figure on the edge of senior duties, began appearing beside Catherine at key events. No words needed to be exchanged. Their partnership had already spoken volumes. Camilla's presence began to shrink, not in title but in influence. Legacy-related committees, historical appointments, even press briefings began excluding her voice. Not with cruelty, but with finality. The Queen Consort had not been dethroned, but she had been rerouted, her reign reduced to function rather than feeling. And in quiet contrast, Catherine's role became radiant. Not for spectacle, but for steadiness. Charles, watching from his place at the center, yet increasingly at the edges of real power, finally broke his silence in private. In a meeting with senior aides, he acknowledged Catherine's handling of the situation, calling it the most dignified act of loyalty and restraint he had seen since the Queen's final year. He offered no reversal, no denial. Just one line that reverberated like thunder among those who heard it: "She has done what I could not." And so the image became inevitable. Catherine, walking through Windsor not for ceremony but for duty, the archive in hand, no flinch, no spectacle, just a woman carrying history forward. The cameras flashed, the public watched, and for the first time, no one questioned who the real center of the monarchy had become. And so, from a sealed case came not just documents, but destiny. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.